Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. The website is foreigncountries.podbean.com. If you're enjoying Foreign Countries and you think it's worth $2 a month just to keep it going, please become a patron of the show. Go to patron.podbean.com/foreign countries. Archaeobotanical studies have long been rooted in processual approaches to archaeology, but in recent years there have been attempts at more nuanced understandings of the social relationships based around plant species. Later on, I'll be speaking to Professor Patty Baker about sensory environments and health concerns in Roman gardens. But first, I'm joined by Dr. Lisa Lodwick of All Souls, Oxford. Lisa has several recent publications on human interactions with plant environments and the evolving research agenda in archaeobotany. Lisa, what's your starting point for this?
So the original background, yes, where it all started was during my PhD research, I was undertaking detailed archaeobotanical study of a late Iron Age Roman town called Silchester. So much of this work was looking at charred plant remains, so things like cereals, reed seeds, because that's mainly what we find from archaeological settlements. But occasionally you find kind of glimpses of other activities. So I had a few lentils in some enigmatic burnt pits alongside some sheep remains. And this is when we normally trot out, we're kind of like, oh, this is a ritual plant offering, it's something special and distinctive. Likewise, when we look at waterlogged plant assemblages, so things from wells and kind of ditches and that kind of thing, most of what we're looking at archaeobotanically is evidence from either kind of dumped stabling waste or settlement vegetation. But again, we always get glimpses of, say, more purposeful planting, so ornamental plants, horticultural plants. And again, there was a question of, well, how do we interpret these? So looking at previous archaeobotanical studies from the Roman period, these are normally, when we find these kind of glimpses of ritual or horticultural activity, they're just labelled as Roman. So this is a Roman pine cone or a Roman box leaf, and it's clearly shown that someone was undertaking Romanised activity. And I didn't really think this was either kind of interesting in itself or a kind of sufficiently, complex way to interpret what really interesting archaeobotanical finds. So that's kind of how I first got interested in these kind of implications, both ritual and gardens, from the archaeobotanical evidence. And then coming at these particular questions posed in this paper, there's been much study really in the last 10 years looking at new plant foods in the Roman period. So, a large number of flavourings, fruits, vegetables were introduced to areas, especially in northwestern Europe, so Gaul, Germany, Britain. And so there's been detailed work by the likes of Alex Levada and Marijke van der Veen, tracing how these new foods like coriander and plum were adopted. But there's been far less focus on the more kind of enigmatic, we could call them ornamental or ritual plants. So really there was a kind of clear gap in the literature of saying, okay, well, we know new food plants were introduced, but to what extent did the Roman period also cause a change in the kind of trees and shrubs growing in Britain at the same time? And whilst I was thinking about this from a very much archaeobotanical perspective in Britain, there's also growing interest in this, particularly in Italy. So people such as Catherine Gleason, Annalisa Marzano have been looking at the role of plants and gardens in creating both private villa gardens, but also in public space, porticos, etc. So there's really kind of like growing interest in how plants are consciously used. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to take a deep dive into the archaeobotanical evidence from Britain and see what was happening with two specific plants here.
So drawing on artefact studies, how have you applied that to botanical remains?
So the thought process was really, I was trying to follow an approach of treating plant remains as more of almost artefacts, so taking a more material culture perspective. And if you look at studies such as Hella Eckhart or Martin Pitts or Andrew Gardner, who are working with objects from a Roman period, what you essentially do is you look at the social distribution and the chronological distribution, and then you take a kind of detailed approach to both, where these objects were deposited, or evidence there is for a kind of like object biographies, and how we can start to consider the kind of effective role of objects. And this is all, very, widely studied. So I was trying to take that kind of detailed approach to the archaeobotanical evidence. So rather than just saying, here's a stone pine cone, I wanted to say, okay, well, where was it deposited? What kind of condition was it in? Can we look at how it was used, how it was treated, how it was burnt, etc. So to that end, I undertook a literature review, so looking for any plant macrofossils, so seeds, nutshell, leaves, etc., from box and stone pine, Pinus pinnea, from any archaeobotanical reports from Roman Britain. Due to the upsurge of developer-funded excavation since PPG 16, there's a mass of archaeobotanical evidence, largely biased towards urban sites and places which have seen much development in the last kind of few decades. But even so, there's a very good broad spread of archaeobotanical evidence. So by kind of sifting through this, talking to colleagues, using the Full Settlement of Roman Britain database, I was able to come up with a catalogue of 31 sites where box has been found and then 41 sites where stone pine has been found. It was then a case of looking at how these different plants were found throughout time, by settlement types, and where the detailed reporting was available, can we say something more about how the plant was growing or how it had been deposited.
Right, so what contexts do these remains appear in? Where do you get them?
Okay, so in terms of box, there's very few finds of box from the kind of what we call the early Roman period, so the 1st century AD, and then we start to find a few kind of leaves and twigs right at the end of the 1st century. The main period when it turns out is in the 2nd, 3rd and 4th centuries, predominantly at urban sites, so in this case London, Silchester and York, also at villa sites, few burials, inhumations, and then also a few what we would kind of religious temple sites. And most of these finds are either box leaves or small twig sections with leaves attached. And nearly all of these are only from waterlogged deposits, which means we're only seeing evidence for box where these on-site waterlogged sediments are present. In terms of stone pine nuts, again, these are predominantly found at urban sites, but there's a large number of these turning at temples, so places such as the Triangular Temple in Vermilanium, where lots of charred pine nuts and bracts were found, the Mithraeum at Corpora on Hadrian's Wall, but then also more kind of enigmatic, we could say, ritualized activities. So you find whole pine cones deposited at places such as Winchester in Wiltshire, or even just in settlement ditches on the outskirts of farmsteads and villas.
And how were the species used? How were people relating to them in Roman Britain?
Okay, so when thinking about these plants, it's a question of, how do they affect people? What did these plants do in the past? So with like the pine cones, we can start to think about what the sensory experiences would have been when they were offered. Outside of some fascinating evidence from the amphitheatre in London, there doesn't seem to be any convincing evidence that stone pine was being grown in Roman Britain. So the main kind of area in which you introduced pine cones were kind of acting on or affecting people would have been through ritualized experiences. So if we think about stone pine cone, when you burn it, it has a very distinctive kind of like crackling, fiery noise. It would have emitted like light and a very kind of strong smell. And then in some cases, it seems that purposefully made Pinus pinnea incense would have been used, with suggestions on Hadrian's Wall. So we can see that when these offerings were made in a kind of range of ritualistic spaces, it would have had a very strong kind of like sensory impact, creating very distinctive memories.
And native box as well?
In terms of box, there is good evidence that box was growing in Britain just based on the number of sites where leaves and twigs have been found. And then we can start to think about how the characteristics, or we could say plant materialities of the box as a growing plant would impact humans in the surrounding area. So in that case, we can think through things such as appearance of a plant, its growth habit, and again, its kind of sensory attributes, and how these compare to what we would call the kind of like native Holocene vegetation already growing in Britain. What is particularly interesting about box is that it's an evergreen shrub, so it keeps its leaves all year, and they have a very kind of glossy feel to them. Now, it's a very kind of dense growth habit, so it's quite different to other low-growing shrubs in Britain. And then it also has a distinctive smell is unpleasant. So it would seem like quite a odd addition.
So the choice of box must be quite particular, deliberate.
I think what's really interesting is that it can, in many ways, form a kind of barrier. Like, it's a very dense plant, and it doesn't have many insects or animals that utilize it or grow on it. So at sites where it's been found in towns such as One Poultry in London or Insula 9 Silchester, it seems to be growing at the edge of individual property. So it's very much acting as a barrier between perhaps private residential space and the more public thoroughfares. Now, I think it's also interesting to think about how it would have affected temporal experiences of daily life, the fact that it looks pretty much the same all year when it does flower in a very small kind of inconspicuous white flowers. So it really would have and would cause a kind of blurring of the seasons, which I think is really interesting when we take into account other shifts in temporality from, changes in farming practice or integration of the market economy and use of coinage in new calendars.
So in terms of future research, where do we go from here in archaeology? And in fact, are there potentially wider implications outside our immediate discipline?
So in terms of future work, I think there's a few strands kind of coming out of this. One is in terms of these particular plants. I think especially box, when it is good evidence for at least, if not a complete introduction, it's certainly a much wider spread in where it's being grown and cultivated. So we need to think about how box is managed today. Box today is currently at risk from both box tree caterpillar and box tree moth. So these both attack the shrubs. So important collections of box shrubs in modern gardens, horticultural locations are currently being really targeted. And this is the same for places such as Turkey and Georgia, where box tree forests, which are really important economic resources, are really being attacked. So I think there's a lot of scope for thinking about, okay, if box was spread widely in the Roman period, how does that impact on the current management in the face of plant diseases spread by climate change? And then the second strand of future work is if we can accept that plants have a capacity to affect or act upon humans, what happens when we think about this more widely? Some of my more recent work has been looking at the impact of arable weeds, so things such as corn cockle, which was widely spread in the later Iron Age and Roman period, and how that has the capacity to affect on health and diet, and also routine agricultural labour. And I think much more widely outside of the Roman period, other people such as Barry Taylor, Susie Richard, Ben Geary are really starting to take a more, we could call it plant agency or plant materiality approach, especially in the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods. So I think there's huge scope for taking plants more seriously and both working with the archaeobotanical data that we have, but also taking more, creative or imaginative approaches for thinking about plants in a more holistic way.
Right, certainly from this point of view, archaeobotany is taking a much more critical and interpretive approach now.
Okay, so my 2019 Internet Archaeology paper pulls together a range of perspectives on really how we can move archaeobotany forward as a discipline. And one of them is by taking a more theoretically informed and critical stance of how we interpret archaeobotanical evidence. I mean, much of archaeobotany is rooted in processual archaeology and middle range theory, and for have excellent results, but there's certainly a lot of scope for taking more theoretically driven approaches. So alongside discussing box and stone pine, I also started to think about the what we could call the ecological temporality of agricultural practices, which I developed further in the 2019 article in the Journal of Social Archaeology. And then also thinking a bit more widely about how we can make plants more present in how we kind of communicate archaeobotanical findings in public engagement or thinking about current challenges which plants have a key role in terms of farming or sustainability.
So a theoretically informed agenda in archaeobotany. And that's what I want to develop now. So thank you, Lisa Lodwick. I'm joined now by Patty Baker, Professor of Archaeology and Associate of the University of Kent. Patty's recent work has concentrated on the Roman garden as a sensory environment and how people experience those beneficial spaces. Patty, How should we understand healthy spaces and environmental experiences?
Well, my research was always on ancient medicine, where I looked at medical tools, buildings that were identified as hospitals, and I published 2 monographs on that. And I began to develop an interest in healthy spaces when I was looking at how hospitals were identified in the ancient world. And part of that, I realized there was a lot of description in the ancient literature, and there's a lot of scholarship on a work by Hippocrates called Airs, Waters, Places, which talks about healthy environments. But nobody's actually looked at what did they mean by a healthy environment, and how did the Greeks and Romans actually experience an environment. So they could say that an environment was healthy if it had a warm, dry climate or something like that. But they never explain, the literature doesn't explain why that's healthy or how that climate actually makes someone healthy. So there was a gap in that area of research.
Right, so how do you address that gap?
I was asked to do a paper on sensory studies, looking at taste, ancient medicine, and archaeology, which I thought, I'm up for a challenge, I'll try that. And basically, I had to look at literature, archaeology, and look at how they were incorporated. And I found that there was the way people in the ancient world understood the senses to work in relation to health was, if I look at something, for example, if I taste something, it comes directly into me, either what I see or what I taste or what I touch, and that will have a direct effect on the humors inside the body. So where there was a gap was actually exploring how the landscapes actually inform the health within the body. And I recognize that in the ancient world, they probably saw it as a sensory experience. So you look at something, that thing comes into your eyes, and then it will affect the humors. So that was the lack, that was what was missing in the scholarship. And then, so as I started doing this, I became more interested in gardens, healthy spaces. That was something, it's a growing area of research anyway in the ancient world. More and more people are starting to look at them. So that was new as well. And since Romans, especially the Romans, had in Italy have gardens at the back of their houses, at least in Pompeii, Herculaneum, and elsewhere around the Mediterranean, began to explore, well, why did they have these? There are numerous reasons, but I think one of the reasons was they were also so healthy places, or places where you could leave the city, at least for a little bit, get to the back of your house. The gardens are placed at the back of the houses. They're walled, they're quieter, and they have green spaces, all of which were described by the ancient medical writers as being healthy. So that's where the research developed, was looking at the experiences in the gardens. Then the next thing that developed out of that was when I was reading the literature, a lot of the ancient writers, they didn't have to be medical, it was just people writing letters. Vitruvius on his work on architecture, and even later in the 4th, 5th century AD, Vegetius in his work on the Roman army, all talk about where you, what is a healthy space? Where do you build and why is it healthy? And all of them, and even the writers, say that they go to these healthy spaces because the air is pure. And then I began to wonder, well, what do they mean by pure air? In contrast, sometimes they'll say you don't want to build in a marshy area because the air, it smells foul and it's stagnant. And that was all I really had to go on. So I wanted to know a bit more about why they keep talking about pure air. How did they recognize it? And how did it affect the body? So the next question was, for the paper especially, was how was it recognized? And how did it affect the body? So the sensory studies came directly into this. So first, vision. I noticed that descriptions of clarity usually refer to, the Latin is candidus or white. Sometimes they use alba, but sometimes white or bright air was often used in ancient literature. So something that was clear. So you didn't have smog or haze or fog, for example. Another thing that they talk about when they talk about clear is sometimes they'll mention the color blue. Now, blue can also be a bad color. It can sometimes, like you were just mentioning how it's raining, and it can be very heavy, dark blue, but a light blue sometimes represents a very clear sky. So if you had a clear sky with good air, it would be light blue. So they were 2 ways of recognizing that the air was pure. Another color that's important for health is green. Green's especially important for refreshing the eyes and refreshing the humors within the body. And this comes up in a lot of ancient literature if you start looking around. And Vitruvius in his work on architecture actually says a good thing to do is have a lot of green spaces, especially around, he's talking about theaters and baths, but it could apply to houses as well. But when you're walking around, when you're looking at the greenery, it comes in and clears your humor. So these three colors were how I think people could recognize a healthy, clean air through vision. Another was through smell. Bad air, the writers often talk about as being miasmic. It usually smells foul or like a marsh, just stagnant air. But interestingly, for pure air, it's basically that it shouldn't have any smell or just a hint of natural smells like flowers or trees, pines, things like that will come up. But it shouldn't be strong. It's just something that's in the background. So if you have fresh air that way. And the third way was the movement of the air. You can't have stagnant air. If it's just sitting there, it's not good. But if you have air that moves, it also means through the wind, it means that it was healthy air.
So, as an archaeologist, how did you try to understand Roman concepts of these healthy spaces?
For this one, even though I consider myself more of an archaeologist, for this one, I actually did a lot of, I looked at the ancient literature first. So that was what really gave me the idea, when they're writing about this, I wanted to know what they meant. Looking at the ancient medical texts, the architectural texts such as Vitruvius and Vegetius, again, on military matters. Then a lot of letters, actually, just like by Pliny the Younger, for example. Seneca mentions a few bits about gardens. Poetry as well also talks about, it's obviously idealized, but it's still playing on the same idea that you want a restful, healthy space. And then the question was, well, what was this like in reality? And is there a way I can compare what's found in the archaeological material with the literature? So I looked at gardens in Pompeii and Herculaneum, mainly because they've been excavated. There are gardens in other areas of the Roman Empire, but they haven't been studied as much. So I focused on where we had the most information. And I began to look at common elements found within these gardens. So you quite regularly find fountains, which would have been moving water, and moving water was also a representation of air. So if you had moving water, that was supposed to cool the air. You think about air conditioning today, the idea is if you buy cool water, it'll cool you, and it's good for the air. It's not stagnant water. Another thing is there's a lot of greenery and flowers. So you get a mixed greenery, trees, cypress, for example, olive, were just a few different types of flowers, all with scents. A lot of roses was another thing that came up. And roses in the ancient world were supposed to smell quite nice. They do mention that a lot in literature. So you get a lot of this. But another thing was the views in the garden. Not all, but in a lot of gardens, they have fresco paintings on the back of the gardens of gardens themselves to make the garden look even larger. And this was a way of just sort of looking out into a larger garden, a larger green space. And the paintings are all fairly similar. You had lots of greenery, fountains, birds. So everything in the garden seemed to match up with what the literature was saying. At least although the literature is obviously idealized, either people in the gardens were basing it on this idealized view or vice versa. The literature is based on what people found in the gardens. I don't know which came first, but it's this interaction. So what was nice about this case is the archaeology and the literature actually seemed to match up. People were trying to create these healthy spaces. And interestingly enough, even if they had very small houses with maybe just a light well, there's been found garden painting, fresco paintings in them, maybe a tiny little fountain, and sometimes even just lots of pot plants, just to, again, recreate this green space.
And putting all those things together, what have you learned about concepts of good mental health?
Yes, this is another area I've started to develop in my own research. When I started looking at the gardens, I have to tell you a quick story about how I thought about looking at gardens. I did a teaching exchange at Virginia Tech, and the person whose office I was using, his name's Glenn Bew, he had a beautiful painting of Livia's villa, the garden fresco painting at Livia's villa in Rome, Prima Porta in Rome. And I was just staring at it thinking, that looks so nice. I wonder how the Romans actually felt in that, in that room or in the gardens. And that's actually what got me started on it, was just thinking about my own experiences in green spaces. It's always very relaxed, it's very nice. And I began to wonder that's what led on. How did the Romans experience? Did they see it as healthy? And they ultimately do describe them as healthy spaces. Pliny the Younger is very clear about that in his letters. He likes to get away to the gardens because he finds it good for his mental health, his physical health. He even says that it's good for his slaves' health. He said he hadn't lost a single slave out in his villas because it's a healthy space.
Do you believe him?
I'm sure he's exaggerating, but they're good stories. But then I also began to look into environmental psychology, which is it's a developing field today, looking at how people react in green spaces. And there was actually an article in National Geographic which first informed me about this. I think it was in 2015. But there was one paragraph said, oh, they were aware of this in the ancient world, but they didn't understand science. So they didn't understand how this worked. But it worked according to their understanding of the humors. But I think we can actually learn quite a bit from them, because they do talk about getting into the green spaces. It's good for us. But I think if we take that further today, if more and more people care about the environment, want to work on it, and understand that it's healthy for them, that actually probably want to work on environmental sustainability a bit more. I think if we understand that it's actually really good for us personally, that more people might want to take care of the environment rather than just think I'm doing it for somebody else. I think from that, we could just learn some of their gardening techniques. They had to be organic, they didn't have pesticides. They do, if you look at some of the garden literature or the agronomists, they talk about what are good bugs and bad bugs and how to get rid of different pests. So somebody might want to experiment with that.
And that brings us on to experimental archaeology. You've since been able to put some of these ideas into practice.
Okay, in February this past year, the Trust for Internet Archaeology contacted me because they'd heard I was interested in Roman gardens. And they had a plot of a garden by their building, which they wanted to develop, and they thought about recreating a Roman garden as a way to, as an place to do some experimental archaeology, and also as a place to do some displays. And we decided to use half the garden to recreate a Roman garden. So what we did, it's surrounded on 3 sides by walls. So it was almost like an enclosed Roman garden, the space already. It's also a sun trap, so it had a very nice Mediterranean feel to it. It's very hot. And what we did was we divided it. So we put 4 raised flower beds, like you might find in Pompeii, with a water feature in the center. And at the back, we put box hedge, which you often find in Roman gardens, and made an apsidal end, put fig trees and a vine. We're trying to take some plants that grew in Britain as well as the Mediterranean. And then we filled the flower beds with plants that grew locally to Britain and to that area, because we thought if the Romans were to come over to Britain, and if they did create gardens, which we think they may, there seems to be evidence for it, Fishbourne Palace, for example, and they probably weren't going to ship in most of the plants. They would probably just take plants and flowers from the area. So there was a local sage, for example, iris, and we also made a covered walkway. Well, it's a pergola to imitate a Roman walkway. So part of that was just to try and understand how the Romans might have built their gardens based on plans we found at Pompeii. And what was nice about it, it raised a lot of questions of how did they source their plants. I mean, we cheated. We used electric drills to make flower beds. And so, how long would it have taken them to actually build something? What materials did they use? And then we would go back and look at the archaeology from Pompeii or Herculaneum. And some of the questions had already been answered, like they may have used their own cement or mortar to make garden ponds or fountains. It was very useful for raising questions about how they were constructed. But what was always nice was when the volunteers came out, started to ask a lot of questions, were very interested, but they all said that they loved doing it because at the end of the day, it was very peaceful back there. You couldn't really hear traffic. It was warm. It made them feel healthy and happy. So it's just the actual experience of working in the garden, as well as just sitting in the garden. Sometimes I would get there early in the morning just to try and to understand how a Roman might have experienced it in a quiet. And it did actually feel very healthy. So, and then what the Trust for Internet Archaeology is going to continue doing is continue working on it, so that if anybody's in the area, they can contact them and go visit it themselves, because they want more people to visit or volunteer to help maintain it.
So expanding on the sensory experience of Roman gardens, is there more work to be done on the soundscapes?
The paper I originally was telling you about was Pure Air, was actually originally based on smells in gardens, but another healthy aspect of gardens that I've read about are sounds. There's a lot written about the sounds of birds. Bird sounds are apparently very healthy in the ancient world, and also chimes, the sound of water, and the sound of wind. So I just want to look a little bit more about how sounds are healthy. And again, I think it's related to the other research, where if you're looking at something, you bring it into the body and it affects your humors. The same way that ancient philosophers talk about sound is, again, that sound will enter your ear, go to your brain, and then again have effect on the humoral balance within your body. Very much on similar lines to the previous paper, but I do think more needs to be said about sounds in the relationship to healthy body.
And you've been working on ways to bring these Roman experiences to a wider audience?
It was a public outreach event by the Society for the Promotion of Roman Studies in London. And I was invited to give a talk on sensory experiences in Roman Britain. And they wanted something a bit more hands-on because it was public outreach. I thought, oh, well, actually, even in Roman Britain, you see pictures of people wearing flower crowns. So flower crowns are very common, or that's what gave me the idea, oh, I'll try and recreate a Roman crown. And also sensory, it was tactile, so I could explain that there's a sensory experience to that, and there's smells involved as well, and you need vision, so it's a full sensory experience. As I was recreating these, I thought, well, actually, this would be a fun little project to do an outreach, a little book on, just talking about the history of Roman flower crowns, their meanings, because the different flowers mean things, or the different greenery, they mean something, and then possibly suggesting how they could be made. There's a bit of academic work in there, a bit of experimental archaeology, but it's also meant more for the general public as well. So I thought this is a nice way to bring ancient history and archaeology to people who would normally never look at it.
Now, you were not the first to recreate the Roman garden experience, and I know that you've been looking into a predecessor in the field.
Okay, that was with a colleague of mine, Giacomo Savani. He also, his main work is on Roman baths and bathing, mine's in the gardens. But he found out about a conference at the British School at Rome that was this past December 2019. And it was on collections at the Villa Albani. But there was this one aspect of it where they wanted to know more about the landscape surrounding the Villa Albani, which is in Rome. Albani was a cardinal and he collected a lot of Roman antiquities. But what's interesting about his garden around his villa had a recreation of a Roman bath, and the garden was supposed to be based on an ancient Roman design. So what we looked at jointly was how they recreated the garden and the bath. The bathhouse looks very similar to a Roman bathhouse. The garden is much more like a Renaissance garden, but still we just say that they're based on an idealized view of what the ancient Romans would have had. And then we both argue that the bath and the garden were put together because of this idea that gardens were healthy spaces, as were baths in the ancient world. And around a lot of the larger city baths, you do find gardens. So we were just saying this is Albani trying to recreate a beautiful Roman space around his villa.
So was Albani working on the same texts of Vitruvius and Pliny that you were looking at?
Yes, he's definitely doing that. He's definitely looking at those texts. What's also interesting is other 18th and 19th century visitors to the Villa Albani garden compare it directly to these ancient texts of Vitruvius and ancient Roman design.
So that was Patty Baker on Roman concepts of botany, healthy living and the sensory environment. Thank you so much, Patty. All these publications are detailed on the website. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Foreign Countries. Join me next time for another conversation.